Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere ancient, golden, and honestly kind of terrifying. You're standing at the edge of the Sahara, sand whispering around your ankles, when a colossal pyramid rises from the dust, shimmering like a mirage. But the closer you get, the clearer the screams buried in its stones become. These aren't bedtime stories about mummy curses or golden tombs. They're about the pharaohs who built their legacies on suffering, control, and, well, the occasional human sacrifice. You probably won't survive this lineup of rulers if they catch you breathing their royal air. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and what time it is where you're listening. I'm always curious who's out there in the dark with me. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin with Sneferu, Egypt's first true pyramid builder, the father of architectural dreams, and possibly some seriously dark nightmares. On the surface, he's remembered fondly. The ancient Egyptians called him the good god, which, let's be honest, already raises a red flag. Anytime a ruler brands himself the good one, history tends to whisper otherwise. Sneferu reigned during the Old Kingdom, around 2600 BCE, and is credited with a trio of pyramids: the Bent Pyramid, the Red Pyramid, and possibly the Midam Pyramid. That's a lot of stone, and a lot of labor. And no, he didn't do it with cranes and coffee breaks. You picture thousands of workers. Some say they were well-fed conscripts. Others say slaves by another name, dragging limestone blocks through the desert heat, day in, day out. And the quirky bit? Sneferu was obsessed with doing it right. The Midam Pyramid collapsed. The Bent Pyramid, with its sudden angle change halfway up, looked like a drunken sandcastle. So, naturally, he said, one more, and built the Red Pyramid. Third time's the charm, but also the most lives lost, according to fringe speculation. Here's the twist: historians still argue whether Sneferu's workforce was brutalized or honorably employed. Some records claim the workers had rations, housing, and even medical care, but others suggest those so-called perks were only for skilled artisans. The rest? Probably dropped like flies under the blazing sun, buried in unmarked graves beneath the shadows of his towering ambition. And Sneferu didn't just build structures, he built a persona. Tales say he once took a boat trip rowed by young women in fishnet clothing just to lift his spirits. One lost a trinket in the Nile, and rather than comfort her, Sneferu demanded the entire lake be parted. Spoiler, it wasn't Moses, and no seas were split, but it does tell you something about his priorities. The way he combined charm, creativity, and command makes him dangerous in a subtle way. You'd probably like him at first. He'd smile, show you a new temple, offer a cup of wine, and the next thing you know, you're hauling granite while a scribe logs your slow demise as necessary for glory. Sneferu's legacy is wrapped in polished limestone, but beneath it lies a foundation of bones, many of which were forgotten before the last capstone was ever placed. The weirdest bit? His Red Pyramid is one of the few you can actually go inside today. You walk through narrow, echoing corridors, and the air still tastes of centuries-old secrets. One archaeologist even claimed he felt a heavy pressure, like something didn't want him there. Was it guilt, or just bad ventilation? So here's your first lesson in Egyptian rule. Not all monsters snarl. Some wear gold, smile wide, and stack monuments that outlast Empire Saul, while ensuring their workers didn't outlast the scaffolding. You're still brushing sand off your arms when the shadow of a second pyramid looms even larger. This one is perfection, every angle sharp, every stone tight like puzzle pieces forged by gods. It's the Great Pyramid of Giza, and at its heart sat Khufu, or, as the Greeks later called him, Cheops. Same guy, worse reputation. Khufu's name survives in two ways: etched into a stone block inside the pyramid's hidden chamber, and whispered like a warning across millennia. The thing about Khufu is, he didn't just want a monument. He wanted the monument, something colossal enough to immortalize him, and merciless enough to erase anyone who opposed him. And you, walking through his imagined kingdom, can feel the tension every brick seems to hiss with the echo of command. While his father Sneferu was charming, Khufu was cold. You probably wouldn't get invited to his royal boat parties, or if you did, you'd be rowing, not sipping anything. Mainstream accounts tell us he ruled around 2580 BCE. He oversaw the construction of the only one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world still standing today. You've heard that part before, but what they don't always say, his rule may have been a reign of fear masked by stone. According to Herodotus, that dramatic Greek historian who loved a good exaggeration, Khufu shut down all temples, forced women into prostitution to raise funds for the pyramid, and made every able-bodied man in Egypt serve. 3 shifts of labourers, tens of thousands at a time, dragging and stacking more than 2 million stone blocks. Now, modern scholars scoff at Herodotus's more lurid claims, but here's the weird fringe twist. Some graffiti found in workers' quarters refers to their crews as things like the drunkards of Menkaure or the friends of Khufu. Jokes? Bonding? Irony? You'll never know. But something tells you humour was a last resort under this guy's watch. Historians still argue whether Khufu was truly a tyrant or simply misunderstood. Some say the centralization of power during his reign enabled extraordinary achievements. Others see it as a top-down squeeze that bled the countryside dry. The lack of surviving records about his personality only makes things spookier. It's like he built a pyramid to bury not just his body, but his story. And then there's the pyramid itself. You wander inside, crouching through narrow shafts built with maddening precision, wondering how anyone even designed this thing without laser levels or iPads. Above you, 15-ton ceiling slabs, perfectly placed. Beneath you, hidden chambers never meant to be found. At one point, you pass the king's chamber, silent and still, yet you swear you hear something move. Could be your imagination. Could be Khufu reminding you who's boss. Some Egyptologists suggest the pyramid wasn't built by slaves, but by seasonal workers farmers drafted during the Nile's flood season, when their fields were underwater. Still, does being temporarily unpaid and sunburnt really soften the blow? And get this, Khufu was also obsessed with secrets. He ordered the burial chamber deep inside the pyramid with booby traps, false doors, and a granite sarcophagus too large to fit through any entrance. Meaning, it had to be placed there during construction. That's not foresight, that's paranoia, dressed as architecture. Quirky sidebar, a tiny ivory statue of Khufu, barely 3 inches tall, is one of the few physical depictions we have of him. You built the biggest stone monument on Earth, and history leaves you looking like an action figure from a cereal box. And yet, despite all his effort, we still don't know where his actual body is. His sarcophagus is empty. No mummy, no burial goods. Just a hollow space where a king once dreamed of eternity. Some say his tomb was robbed. Others claim it was never used. But if you believe the more imaginative theories, Khufu never planned to stay. He wanted to become the pyramid. Eternal, untouchable. A monument not to his life, but to his dominance. And so, as you step outside, blinking into the harsh moonlight reflecting off those ancient stones, remember, the real weight of the Great Pyramid isn't in its size. It's in the lives, the fear, and the silence that Khufu buried with it. Now the wind shifts, and the air thickens with heat that clings like guilt. You turn your head, and there squatting just beyond the horizonis, a massive figure with the body of a lion and the head of a man, the Great Sphinx, immovable, unblinking, uncaring. That stony face, most likely modelled after Khafre, son of Khufu, and quite possibly the pharaoh who perfected the art of being terrifying while doing absolutely nothing to hide it. Khafre reigned around 2550 BCE, and if his father was feared, Khafre turned fear into performance art. You don't rule by crushing dissent, you rule by convincing everyone that resistance is literally carved into the stone as futile. The guy built his own pyramid, slightly shorter than Khufu's, but perched it higher on bedrock so it looks taller. Petty? Sure. Effective? Extremely. He wanted you to think of him not just as a king, but as an immortal force of the universe. No soft edges, no family man image, just pure, granite-hard absolutism. Mainstream historians praise the craftsmanship of his pyramid complex. It's orderly, disciplined, and eerily symmetrical, like someone obsessed with perfection had way too much time and power. But when you walk the causeway leading from his valley temple up toward the pyramid, something feels off. The stone walls are too smooth, the statues too identical. It's less a royal necropolis and more a control freak's afterlife bunker. And that Sphinx? Khafre's silent watchdog. Though some scholars still debate whether it's actually his face, others argue it could belong to Jedafre, another son of Khufu who briefly ruled before Khafre conveniently took over. Historians still argue whether Khafre came to power legally or shoved his way into it while the ink on the last will was still drying. Either way, he wasted no time building his legacy out of limestone and looming dread. You imagine approaching his throne room. No music, no laughter. Just the sound of sandals scraping against stone and the weight of judgment behind narrowed eyes. Khafre didn't need to punish you himself. His gaze probably made your ancestors apologize. And the moment you knelt, you'd realize you weren't in the presence of a man. You were in a system, a machinery of divinity, a permanent monument to a ruler who didn't have to shout because the desert did it for him. Here's a quirky tidbit. The Sphinx's nose? Gone. Long gone. Most people blame Napoleon's troops or ancient Vandals, but no one really knows for sure. One fringe theory claims it was deliberately destroyed to prevent the Sphinx from speaking or seeing, as if even stone couldn't be trusted in the presence of Khafre's enemies. You laugh it off, but not too loudly. You're still standing in his shadow, after all. Despite his architectural feats, there's almost nothing personal written about Khafre. No tales of humor, sorrow, or mercy. It's as if he chose to erase himself from memory in every way except for the structures. You don't get stories, you get statues, all with the same blank expression. Cold, royal, unreachable. He turned his image into a standard, like a corporate logo that doesn't blink. It's telling, isn't it? Khafre's time on Earth left barely a whisper, but his monuments still force tourists to stare upward in awe. He didn't just build tombs, he built obedience that could last thousands of years. And while the average Egyptian was likely taxed into dust funding his stone dream, Khafre sat enthroned, smiling that faint half-smile only men with pyramids can afford. Historians debate whether Khafre's rule was marked by stability or suppression. Did his silence reflect peace? Or did no one dare record their suffering? Some say his reign avoided war and famine. Others argue that the absence of revolt might not mean contentment, it could simply mean fear worked exactly as intended. And perhaps most unnerving of all is how invisible Khafre became. You can't find his mummy. His sarcophagus sits in his pyramid's chamber empty. Like his father, he may have never been buried there. Or maybe he was, and centuries of grave robbers erased him. But a more uncomfortable thought lingers. What if Khafre didn't want to be found? What if the man who controlled every inch of his kingdom decided his final act would be erasure, letting his works survive but not his body? It's a cruel trick of eternity to demand worship but leave no trace of humanity behind. You sit for a moment in front of the Sphinx. The wind has stilled. The sand doesn't move. And for a fleeting second, you swear its eyes narrow. Just a touch, like it remembers your footsteps. Maybe Khafre didn't need guards. Maybe the desert itself is still obeying him. You leave behind the quiet menace of Khafre's stone empire, but the air doesn't get lighter, it thickens, like memory has weight. Now you find yourself stepping into the longest reign in Egyptian history, and arguably one of the loneliest. His name was Pepi II, and he ruled for more than 90 years. Yes, 90. That's not a typo. He outlived generations of advisors, courtiers, generals, and possibly his own patience. But don't let the Child King origin story fool you. Pepi II wasn't sweet or harmless. He was paranoia in a crown, stretched across a century of suspicion. He came to the throne as a boy, probably around 6 years old, and before he was old enough to hold a scepter properly, scribes were already whispering about his divine insight. Sounds adorable, until you realize that growing up as a god means never being told no, ever, not once. And if someone did try, they probably disappeared. You imagine a royal court where everyone smiled a little too widely, laughed a little too hard, and never turned their backs on the boy king who'd one day grow into something far stranger. One famous story says that Pepi II once received a gift of dancing pygmies from the land of Punt-likely modern-day Somalia. His excitement was so intense that he ordered their safe transport back without causing their hearts to fail. Touching, right? Except, most historians think it reveals something else. Pepi's obsession with control, with managing even the most bizarre or minor things in his world. He didn't want them dead not out of compassion, but because it would ruin the spectacle. And as the decades passed, Pepi II didn't just grow older, he grew colder. The early glow of his youthful rule gave way to calcified bureaucracy. Regional governors, or nomarchs, became more powerful as the pharaoh aged and withdrew into isolation. You picture him pacing palace halls, suspicious of every new face, issuing orders no one dared question. Because how do you challenge a man who's ruled longer than your grandparents have been alive? Historians still argue whether Pepi II's reign directly led to the collapse of the Old Kingdom. Some claim his refusal to share real power fractured the centralized state. Others think it was drought and famine. And sure, those played a part. But it's hard to ignore the role of a ruler so long in power that the system simply eroded under the weight of his need to micromanage eternity. Quirky detail? Pepi reportedly hated flies. Like, really hated them. So much so that he allegedly kept naked slaves smeared in honey to lure the flies away from his presence. Now, whether that's true or just a grotesque rumor from bored court scribes, it does say something about his mindset. If he couldn't control nature, he'd buy people to absorb its annoyances. And that's cruelty disguised as hygiene. You walk through the ruins of his capital, Memphis, once a bustling nexus of trade and power. Now it feels hollow, cracked, like even the stones lost their confidence. You find fragments of statues non grand, none boastful. It's as if Pepi II tried to outlast history by erasing its edges. No towering pyramid, just a modest tomb lost in the sands. For a king who lived so long, his legacy feels almost whispered, like a footnote that went on too long and lost its point. There's no grand monument to marvel at this time, just the idea of a boy who ruled until he was bones, clinging to titles while his country starved and fractured. And the real tragedy? He didn't die in a blaze of glory. No coup, no assassination, just a slow, relentless unraveling. You imagine him sitting alone in a quiet chamber, breath rattling, while far beyond his palace walls, chaos bloomed. Civil war, political fragmentation, starvation. But inside, just the shuffle of old sandals and the ever-present hum of flies. And that's the cruelty of Pepi II. Not in lashings or mass executions, but in the decay of a nation too loyal to let go of a king who'd already become a ghost. It wasn't personal brutality. It was administrative apathy at a glacial scale. His punishment wasn't violence, it was indifference. A death by 1,000 ignored crises. Even now, as the moon washes the desert in silver, his presence lingers, not in statues or obelisks, but in how things fall apart when they're held too tightly for too long. You don't always need a sword to destroy an empire. Sometimes, all it takes is a crown that never leaves the head. You think you're used to the stillness of ruins by now, but stepping into the world of Thutmose feels different, sharper, like the air itself remembers blood. He wasn't born into calm prosperity. No, Thutmose came into power during chaos, At the tail end of Egypt's humiliation under the Hyksos, foreign rulers who had seized the north and planted their strange gods in Egyptian soil. For nearly a century, the once mighty Egyptian crown was split and bruised. And then Thutmose rose not as a negotiator, but as a reckoning. He wasn't particularly tall or old or theatrical, but what he lacked in showmanship, he made up for in cold, calculated vengeance. You walk along the outline of what used to be Avaris, the Hyksos capital, and though time has crushed the city into whispers, some part of you swears you can still smell fire. Because when Thutmose finally took it back, he didn't just reclaim land, he punished it. Brick by brick, bone by bone. Mainstream historians acknowledge him as the founder of the 18th dynasty, the start of the New Kingdom, Egypt's most glorious period. But he earned it not with diplomacy, but with siege after brutal siege. It took years of relentless war to drive the Hyksos out, and Thutmose didn't stop there. He chased them all the way into the Levant, razing towns, scattering survivors, salting the wounds. Most kings would have paused to celebrate. Thutmose just kept sharpening his blades. You picture him standing in his war chariot, looking not at the enemies, but at the soldiers behind him. And they're not cheering. They're silent, waiting for the next order, because they know Thutmose isn't done until there's nothing left to challenge him. That's the cruelty wrapped in his legacy. He didn't conquer out of ambition. He conquered out of principle. Historians still argue whether his scorched earth campaign was about national pride or personal obsession. Was he driven by duty to avenge his father and brother both, of whom died fighting the Hyksos? Or did he simply enjoy the power of unchallenged force? The lines blur when your justice leaves cities in ruins. Quirky detail? Thutmose had a mother who was also his PR manager. Queen Ahotep, fierce and politically savvy, is believed to have held the kingdom together during his youth. Some say she even commanded armies herself. Her jewelry was found buried with weapons golden flies, the Egyptian military medal of honor. So while Thutmose swung the sword, his mother might have handed him the whetstone. Once the Hyksos were gone, Thutmose turned his gaze south to Nubia. Their kingdom, Kush, had been asserting itself while Egypt was distracted. That didn't sit well. So he marched there, two-burned, annexed, built fortresses. You walk the banks of the Nile near Buhan and see the remnants of stone walls, garrisons and watchtowers. Not for show, not for trade, for control, unflinching, military control. What makes it all worse is how methodical he was. You want to find a tyrant raving in temples, drunk on power, but Thutmose wasn't messy. He reorganized the treasury, opened new quarries, issued detailed tribute systems. It's like he believed cruelty only counted if it was sustainable. One papyrus mentions prisoners being branded and made to serve in temple workshops, their identities erased under layers of state-sanctioned labor. Others were paraded through cities to remind everyone what happened to those who dared oppose the rightful pharaoh. Mercy wasn't just absent, it was irrelevant. And yet, the people loved him, or feared him so efficiently it felt the same. Temples sang his praises. Priests recorded his victories in elegant hieroglyphs. His tomb inscriptions don't brag, they report. Everything was a record, a statement of results, not emotions. You get the sense that if you met him, he wouldn't bother convincing you of his greatness. He'd just give you a list of what he'd done and expect you to figure it out. One odd fact? His body was discovered in a royal cache in Deir el-Bahari, miles from where he was originally buried. His mummy had been rewrapped centuries after his death, tucked away with other pharaohs like a fireproof archive. And when modern archaeologists unwrapped him, they found a scarred face, no, majestic, but real. A man forged by battle, not ritual. You look into those preserved features and wonder, was there regret? Probably not. Just a quiet satisfaction that he'd buried Egypt's shame and rebuilt its spine. Because that was Thutmose's legacy. He didn't just unify Egypt, he purified it violently, relentlessly. You stand where cities once stood and realize that greatness, when defined by conquest alone, always leaves ashes in its footprints. He wasn't a mad king or a flamboyant despot. He was worse, the kind who believes his violence is necessary, the kind who thinks a broken enemy is a restored order, the kind who never doubts the blade. And now, even the Nile flows past quietly, as if still paying tribute to the man who made peace by eliminating the option of resistance. You drift now into the reign of Thutmose III, and if Amosi was the storm that ended one era, Thutmose was the blade that carved the next. Nicknamed the Napoleon of Egypt, he ruled not just with cunning but with a hunger to dominate every square inch his eyes could scan. Yet unlike Napoleon, Thutmose didn't just lose at the end. He died undefeated, his empire stretching from modern Syria to Sudan, his enemies either dead or so thoroughly assimilated they forgot they ever resisted. But this wasn't expansion for glory, it was a personal mission of erasure, and if you were on the wrong side of his vision, he made sure you didn't stay in history long enough to argue. Thutmose III didn't even start as a full pharaoh. When his father, Thutmose II, died, the throne technically passed to him, but he was too young to rule, so his stepmother Hatshepsut took over. For years she acted as regent, then full-fledged pharaoh, wearing the royal beard and all. She built temples, reformed trade, and made herself a legend. And Thutmose? He waited, quietly, watching, like a seed growing under stone, plotting how he'd split it apart when the time came. When Hatshepsut Diador was nudged toward the afterlife, depending on who you believe, Thutmose III rose not just to the throne but into fury. He didn't just take control, he scrubbed her memory. Historians still argue whether Hatshepsut died naturally or mysteriously disappeared from public life. But what's clear is that afterward, Thutmose launched a historical purge. Her images were chiseled off monuments, her statues destroyed, her cartouche defaced. You walk through the temple of Deir el-Bahari and see empty spaces on walls where once her name sang in gold. That's the cruelty of Thutmose II. Didn't just conquer enemies, he eliminated the inconvenient. The erasure wasn't personal, it was policy. Then came the campaigns. 17 major military expeditions in 20 years. You try to picture that 17 full-scale wars, most of them launched with the precision of a surgeon, but the outcome of a chainsaw. His first major battle was at Megiddo, a fortified city in modern-day Israel. His advisors begged him to take the easy route, a wide, safe valley. Instead, he chose a narrow, treacherous mountain pass that could have easily gotten his entire army killed. Why? Because it was unexpected, and because Thutmose was always 2 steps ahead. And somehow, it worked. He surprised the Canaanite alliance, besieged Megiddo for months, and won a crushing victory. He even took the horses and chariots from the defeated and displayed them like trophies. The quirky bit? He also took their children, not to harm them, but to raise them in Egypt as future loyal administrators. It was conquest with a curriculum. He kept meticulous records too. You stand inside the Karnak temple and find entire walls covered in his campaign. List towns conquered, people subdued, loot gathered. No flowery prose, just receipts. He was the original spreadsheet warrior, and yet, despite his cold efficiency, he had a flair for the symbolic. One tale tells of him planting trees from foreign lands in the gardens of Karnak, so even the soil would remember his victories. But don't let the orderliness fool you. Behind the logistics was a man who punished resistance brutally. Cities that dared rise against him were burned. Rebellions were crushed, not just in combat, but with the full force of state propaganda. The names of rebellious kings were struck from records, their families enslaved. One prince, after surrendering, was paraded through Egypt, chained and forced to watch, as his lands were gifted to Egyptian loyalists. His kingdom didn't just fall, it became a cautionary tale. Historians still argue about whether Thutmose III was a visionary general, or simply the beneficiary of a powerful military system set up by others. But there's no denying his ruthlessness. He built a network of garrisons across Canaan and Nubia, staffed them with Egyptian governors, and turned once independent cities into checkpoints of empire. Each one reminded the locals. The eye of Horus was watching, and it had very sharp teeth. He also had no patience for internal dissent. Priests who favored Hatshepsut were quietly removed. Some were exiled. Others mysteriously lost their titles and lands. You can still see traces of this in temple records. Whole decades of religious leaders vanish without explanation. It's as if the gods themselves changed staff when Thutmose walked in. Quirky side note, he loved obelisks. Not for lighting up the skyline, but for stabbing the heavens with his name. One of his obelisks ended up in Istanbul. Another travelled to London. They still stand, silent witnesses to a man who believed that if he couldn't rule forever, he could at least make sure his name never slept. And in the end, Thutmose III didn't fade away like so many pharaohs before him. He died peacefully, in control of the greatest empire Egypt had ever seen. His mummy, found in the Valley of the Kings, shows a small, wiry man with fine facial bones and clenched hands, like someone who never stopped preparing for the next battle, even in death. You leave his monuments behind, the inscriptions too perfect, too sterile, like they've been scrubbed clean by centuries of frightened reverence. But the silence doesn't comfort you, it warns you. Because if history can be rewritten so easily, what else has been polished out? Thutmose didn't just shape Egypt's empire, he shaped what Egypt remembered and forgot. The heat doesn't lessen, but something shifts less military, more manic. You're no longer in the presence of a calculating general or a vengeance-driven nationalist. Now, you're drifting under a sun that never sets, never blinks, and apparently never listens. Welcome to the strange and unsettling reign of Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh, the divine outlier, and perhaps the weirdest experiment ancient Egypt ever allowed to fester. His cruelty? It didn't come from swords or prisons. It came from ideas, dangerous ones that dismantled the very soul of a civilization. Akhenaten wasn't always Akhenaten. He began as Amenhotep IV, son of the mighty Amenhotep III, born into luxury and spiritual abundance. The gods of Egypt were many, and each had their temple, their festivals, their bureaucracies. It was a system thousands of years old, and then Amenhotep IV decided, nah. Somewhere around year 5 of his reign, he declared that Egypt would abandon the old gods, yes, all of thee, and worship only one, Aten, the sun disk. Not Ra, not Amun, not Osiris, just Aten, a faceless glowing orb, floating above everything like a celestial screensaver. He changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for Aten. He built a new capital, Akhetaten, modern-day Amarnain, the middle of nowhere. He moved the court there, dragged his bureaucracy with him, and began issuing edicts like spiritual software updates. Temples to other gods were shut down or repurposed. Statues were smashed. Priests of Amun, once the most powerful caste in Egypt, were stripped of their privileges, and their god's name was literally hacked out of stone. You walk through Thebes and see gaping holes in temple inscriptions, places where Amun once stood, now erased like a character deleted from a script. Historians still argue whether Akhenaten was a religious visionary, a mad king, or a political tactician trying to wrest control from a powerful priesthood. Maybe all three. But whatever his reason, the people suffered. The massive redirection of resources toward Aten, temples most of which had no roofs. Because Aten needed direct sunlight, meant other civic projects withered. Grain shipments were disrupted. Temples that once doubled as food banks for the poor stopped functioning. And while Akhenaten played architect and prophet in his dream city, the rest of Egypt began to groan under his divine obsession. What's creepy isn't just the theology, it's the imagery. You walk through Amarna's ruins and find bizarre depictions of the royal family. Akhenaten's statues are elongated, almost alien. His skull is stretched, his belly swollen, lips full, arms slender. Scholars debate whether he had a genetic disorder, like Marfan syndrome, or whether this was deliberate stylistic propaganda. Either way, it's unsettling. He didn't want to look human. He wanted to look transcendent, a living bridge between man and Aten. And then there's the family. Akhenaten wasn't a solitary sun worshipper. His wife, the famously beautiful Nefertiti, stood beside him in many carvings, often nearly equal in size and posture. Their daughters were everywhere too, posed in strange, intimate scenes with exaggerated affection. You pass one relief where Akhenaten cradles a child, his head tilted in what should be love, but feels more like performance. Critics have long pointed to the cult of Aten not just as monotheism, but as a personality cult, with Akhenaten himself as its earthly prophet, basking in his own glow. One odd tidbit? There's no evidence that Akhenaten ever punished people openly for clinging to their old gods. There were no mass executions, no religious inquisitions, just a suffocating silence. Old priests lost influence. Scribal schools changed curricula. Festivals vanished from calendars. It wasn't violence, it was void, and void can be crueler than fire. Things grew worse as the years dragged on. The great city of Amarna, built in haste, became a hollow shell. Its tombs were unfinished. Its temples echoed with emptiness. Plague may have struck. Famine is suggested by art showing desperate, thin-bodied figures. Meanwhile, Akhenaten composed hymns to Aten, scribbled prayers into limestone, and stared skyward for answers that never came. One gets the sense that he thought he was saving Egypt, even as it starved around him. Historians still debate the circumstances of his death. Did he die sick? Was he murdered? Was there a palace coup? Whatever happened, the silence afterwards speaks volumes. His successor, possibly his son-in-law, possibly his son, possibly the future king Tut, stepped in, and the first thing they did was abandon Amarna, return to Thebes, and restore the old gods. Akhenaten's name was chiseled from king lists. His memory was condemned in the official damnatio memoria, literally, damnation of memory. You don't just get forgotten in Egypt, you get scrubbed. And yet, his ghost lingers. You pass through what's left of Akhenaten and feel the residue of obsession. The stones are sun-bleached, but they remember. The odd architecture, the cramped houses, the narrow corridors all feel like something built not for comfort, but for containment. Like a city meant to trap something divinia delusional. Akhenaten's cruelty wasn't loud. It didn't wield a whip or sharpen blades. It looked like spiritual purity. It sounded like celestial devotion. But for the average Egyptian, it meant confusion, deprivation, and the disintegration of the world they'd known. He didn't kill his people's bodies, dismembered their beliefs. That's a different kind of violence, one harder to rebel against, because it arrives smiling, speaking of light. And as you stand under the same sun he once worshipped, you wonder if he ever truly saw it or just stared so long he mistook his reflection for the god himself. You would think that after Akhenaten's theological roller coaster, Egypt would want a long nap and a return to simplicity. But history rarely gives us what we want. Instead, the throne passed to a boy, a child who never asked to rule, who may never have even wanted to. You know him, Tutankhamun, the golden boy of modern museums, the glittering mummy in a glass box, the curse magnet. But peel back the tourist glamour, and what you find is something far more chilling. A short life wrapped in politics, surrounded by betrayal, and ending in a mystery no one has ever fully solved. When Tutankhamun took power around age 9 or 10, first thing that happened was a name change. He had been Tutanhaten, living image of Aten, a label branded during Akhenaten's religious purge. But with the heretic pharaoh gone, his handlers wasted no time. They scratched Aten off the official script, reattached the name of Amun, and started repainting temples like a team of overworked PR interns after a scandal. Tutankhamun became a symbol of restoration. A puppet god, held up by priests, generals and bureaucrats desperate to get Egypt back to something familiar. But here's the thing. Kids don't run empires. Behind the boy king stood two Menai, his vizier and probable granduncle, and Horemheb, his general. They guided his policies, wrote his decrees, and according to some decided how long he lived, because Tutankhamun didn't grow up. He died around 18 or 19, and no one agrees on why. Historians still argue whether his death was accidental, medical, or murderous. Was it a chariot crash, as some damage to his body suggests? A genetic disease from generations of royal inbreeding? Or was it poison? A quiet shuffle-off orchestrated by men who saw him as both obstacle and opportunity. His body was found with a shattered leg, signs of infection, and a crushed sternum, though some of that may have been damaged during hasty embalming. Still, the haste itself raises questions. Why was the burial so rushed? The quirky bit is that despite being one of the most famous pharaohs today, Tutankhamun was a minor king in his own time. His tomb is small by royal standards, and his name barely appears in the grand monuments of Egypt. It's almost as if the world forgot him until Howard Carter stumbled into his tomb in 1922, unleashing a global obsession that Tut himself likely never imagined. But back to the cruelty. It doesn't come from the boy himself. By most accounts, he was gentle, even devout. He reinstated traditional worship, reopened temples, and tried to distance himself from the religious upheaval of his father, possibly grandfather, Akhenaten. But that very effort doomed him. Reversing a revolution is no easy task, and Tutankhamun had no military might, no adult authority, and no room for mistakes. So the people around him made the decisions. Decisions that prioritized control over the boy's well-being. You walk through his reconstructed palace ruins and sense it the loneliness of a young king paraded through ritual while decisions swirled around him like smoke. His wife, Ankhesenamun, was likely his half-sister. Their children, both stillborn, were buried in his tomb alongside him. Imagine being a teenager and burying 2 children before your own life ends. That's not a fairy tale. That's a nightmare dressed in gold. One strange detail: when Carter opened Tut's tomb, many of the artifacts appeared repurposed, with other names scratched out and Tut's inserted. It was as if the burial had been assembled from leftovers. The golden burial mask that made him immortal? Possibly made for someone else. Maybe for his successor. Maybe even for a woman. That's the ultimate insulto become iconic, because someone needed a place to dump a king too young to matter. And yet, despite all this, Tutankhamun's afterlife turned out to be louder than anyone expected. The so-called curse of the Pharaohs, sparked by the mysterious deaths of several people connected to the tomb's discovery, became media fodder. But even that points to a deeper truth. Tutankhamun was more powerful dead than he ever was alive. His golden tomb, untouched by grave robbers, became the best preserved time capsule from the ancient world. And suddenly, the forgotten king became Egypt's face to the world. But that's the part that chills you, because it wasn't his power that caused his famine, was his powerlessness. He was used in life, used in death, and used again in modern tourism and mythology. A vessel for agendas he never chose. A symbol of the cruelty not of one man, but of systems religious, political, historical that swallow people whole and spit out symbols. And here's something scholars almost never say aloud. Maybe the curse wasn't on those who opened the tomb. Maybe the curse was what happened before they even sealed it. A child thrust into legacy, forced to clean up a civilizational mess he didn't make, dying before his own name could stand on its own. That's not horror you can see in a museum. That's a different kind of darkness. As you exit the mental corridors of Tutankhamun's world, the silence follows you. Not the silence of kings, but of children who were never allowed to grow up. He never ordered executions, never built massive monuments, never waged wars. But his story bleeds tragedy in a way that many crueler pharaohs only aspired to. His was the cruelty of being remembered by accident, and as you leave, you wonder, what kind of peace is that? You step out of Tutankhamun's fragile shadow, expecting calm, maybe a break from the intensity. But Egypt isn't finished with you yet. Now you walk into an empire fully revived, a machine clicking back into place, and standing at its helm is a man of contradictions. Seti I, graceful in stone, ferocious in memory. If Thutmose III wielded discipline and Akhenaten wielded delusion, then Seti wielded beauty and brutality in equal parts. You don't always recognize cruelty when it's wrapped in elegance, but Seti's reign is where artistry and annihilation dance in lockstep. Seti ruled during the 19th dynasty, around 1290 BCE, and followed Horemheb, the general turned pharaoh who had stabilized Egypt after the mess of the Amarna period. But where Horemheb ruled like a cleanup crew with a sword, Seti was the flourish, afterward the man who wanted Egypt not just restored, but exalted. His temples are some of the most beautiful ever carved, his hieroglyphs sharp, deep, deliberate, like they were etched yesterday. His temple at Abydos, in particular, sings with detail, grace, and scenes of divine order. You almost get lulled by the perfection until you realize what's missing from most of these walls. The defeated. Because Seti, I wasn't just a builder. He was a warrior king, one who launched immediate military campaigns into Canaan, Syria, and Libya. His goal? Reassert Egypt's dominance over territories that had slipped away during the chaos of Akhenaten's reign. And he didn't just fight to win or fought to warn. One campaign in Canaan ended with prisoners marched back to Egypt, strung together, humiliated before statues of the gods. The message was clear. Don't just lose publicly, lose permanently. Historians still argue whether Seti's wars were preventative strikes or attempts at total domination. But either way, they weren't gentle. One mural from Karnak depicts Seti slaying enemies in ritual forearms raised, blade high, hair slicked in stylized arcs of violence. It's almost beautiful, which is disturbing in itself. That's the essence of Seti's cruelty. He didn't hide it. He polished it. Quirky detail? Seti. His name is found in the infamous Abydos King Listan, ancient scroll-through of 76 pharaohs carved into a temple wall. But some names are missing. Akhenaten? Gone. Hatshepsut? Vanished. Seti didn't just restore tradition. He revised it. To him, pharaohs who broke the script didn't deserve to be remembered at all. You erase their name, and in Egyptian belief, you erase their soul. That's not just censorship. That's metaphysical assassination. You walk through the hypostyle hall at Karnak, a forest of stone columns so vast and perfectly aligned it feels more like data storage than architecture. Each beam supports a narrative, each carving a signal of divine legitimacy. Seti didn't build like a mortal. He built like someone who wanted the gods to owe him, and perhaps they did. His religious reforms reinstated the full priesthoods, revived rituals long buried under Akhenaten's son-only dogma, and emphasized ma'at balance, truth, or daraz if the nation itself had been given a stern lecture and a new robe. But balance, as it turns out, often requires sacrifice. Egypt's economy under Seti was strained by constant campaigning. Taxes increased, labor demands grew, and though there's little direct evidence of mass rebellion, the strain is clear in minor records grain shortages, delayed shipments, disputes among provincial governors. The empire was dressed in gold, but some of that glitter was flaking paint. Seti's rule also saw the institutionalization of military service, with clearer hierarchies and tighter control over border territories. Egypt wasn't just at war, it had become a war state, with cities functioning like military supply hubs. One garrison town uncovered near the Sinai shows barracks, stables, armories all constructed with chilling precision. Soldiers weren't just tools of defense, they were cogs in a national strategy. You get the feeling that if Seti could have invented spreadsheets, he would have had columns for dead enemies per cubit marched. There's a theory, fringe but persistent, that Seti planned to expand the empire even further, deep into the Levant and possibly Mesopotamia. Some records speak of diplomatic tension with the Hittites, Egypt's main rival in the north. Though full war would come under his son, Ramesses II, Seti's preparations suggest he was laying groundwork for something far more ambitious. But then, death, sudden, quiet. No grand final campaign, just absence. His mummy, now resting in Cairo, is beautifully preserved. Even in death, Seti looks composed, skin smooth, mouth sealed, like he still has things left unsaid. Some mortuary texts say he was judged by the gods and passed their tests effortlessly. You wonder if they saw the blood behind his crown or just the symmetry of his monuments. And here's a final twist. Among the ruins of Abydos, tucked inside a secret crypt, lies something called the Osiriona subterranean structure, older looking than anything around it, flooded with water and carved from massive blocks. Seti had it built next to his temple, possibly as a gateway to the afterlife, or, as some whisper, a link to even older knowledge. Conspiracy theorists love the place, but stand there long enough, and it doesn't feel mystical. It feels calculated, like even his afterlife had to follow a plan, drawn in grids, etched in stone. Seti doesn't scream like a tyrant. He doesn't demand like a fanatic. But he builds, and what he builds has edges. His cruelty lies in precision everything, just neat enough that no one questions the foundation. And that's the most dangerous kind of ruler, the one who carves truth into marble and then quietly rewrites what truth means. If Seti, I was the artisan king, the architect of silence, symmetry, and subdued control, than his son, Ramesses II, was the blockbuster sequel. Ramesses didn't just want to rule Egypt. He wanted to own it, advertise it, and leave his name stamped on every inch of it, like a child with a label maker in a museum. But behind the statues, behind the temples, behind the carved smiles and thunderous boasts, lived a ruler whose cruelty came not from sadism, but from image maintenance. And when you make a whole empire part of your branding strategy, compassion tends to get buried under limestone. Ramesses II reigned for a staggering 66 years, beginning around 1279 BCE, and during that time, he reinvented the pharaoh role as something closer to a global influencer with a war chariot. You couldn't throw a pebble in Egypt without it landing on a building with his cartouche on it. He added his name to monuments that predated him, sometimes pretending they were his from the start. You walk through Luxor Temple and catch glimpses of earlier dynasties, only to find Ramesses' name chiseled right over them, bold and fresh. He wasn't erasing history, he was rebranding it. Mainstream historians still praise his military acumen, especially his campaign against the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh. It's one of the most documented battles in antiquity. Ramesses ordered the carving of triumphant reliefs all over Egypt, chariots charging, enemies fleeing, the young king standing tall like a god of war. You can almost hear the dramatic soundtrack as you walk along the stone panels. But the funny thing? He didn't win. Not really. The battle was likely a draw, maybe even a tactical loss in parts. But Ramesses controlled the narrative so tightly, even modern visitors sometimes forget the ambiguity. Historians still argue whether this propaganda machine masked a fragile ego or a masterful politician. Maybe both. But there's no denying the scale of his self-promotion. He built the Ramesseum, a mortuary temple that was less a tomb than a monument to his ego. He commissioned Abu Simbel, the cliffside temple in Nubia where 4 giant statues of himself sit staring at the sunrise like sentinels of arrogance. Even his tomb, deep in the Valley of the Kings, was designed with grandeur, though it was robbed, like nearly all royal tombs, and his mummy eventually moved to a safer hiding place. But Ramesses' cruelty didn't lie in violence. Alone it was in exploitation. His building projects were so vast, so frequent, that the human labor behind them becomes invisible. Tens of thousands of workers, many conscripts, many poor, many foreign captives, labored endlessly to keep up with his vision. Deir el-Medina, the workers' village near the Valley of the Kings, offers rare insight into their lives. Graffiti in tombs, papyri detailing strikes over unpaid wages, complaints about grain shortages. It's a chorus of exhausted voices trying to live under the shadow of a god-king who never seemed to pause. One quirky detail: Ramesses outlived most of his immediate heirs. By the time he died in his 90s, Egypt had gone through over a dozen crown princes, some of whom ruled as co-regents. The throne eventually passed to his 13th son, Meremptah. Imagine trying to live in the court of a man who refused to retire, who had dozens of children, and who treated mortality as a minor inconvenience. You can almost hear the palace whispers, "Please, just let the man rest." And yet, Ramesses did have a kind of charm. He wasn't cold like Khafre or manic like Akhenaten. He loved spectacle, pageantry, and grandeur. He adored his wife Nefertari so, much so that he built her one of the most stunning tombs in the Valley of the Queens, painted with scenes of affection and intimacy, rarely seen in royal art. He didn't just marry her, he memorialized her in divine form. But even that tenderness sits in a strange contrast to the sheer weight of his public image. Loving husband? Possibly. PR genius? Definitely. One of the most debated aspects of his reign was his use of foreign labor, especially prisoners of war. Campaigns into Libya, Canaan, and Nubia brought back tens of thousands of captives. These weren't just used for manual labor. Many were resettled in state-controlled settlements, branded as outsiders, and woven into Egypt's economic machinery. Some scholars argue they were treated humanely, given rations and shelter. Others point to skeletal remains bearing signs of hard labor and malnutrition. The truth, as usual, sits somewhere grimly in between. You stand in front of Abu Simbel, those four giant faces gazing down like stone deities, and feel their weight not just literal, but historical. These weren't built to honor gods. They were built so that no matter who you were, Egyptian or foreigner, you would understand who Ramesses the Great was, and you would understand it in fear. His legacy survives not just in stone, but in a carefully curated mythology. Later generations called him the Great Ancestor. Biblical scholars speculate that he may have been the Pharaoh of the Exodus, the one who defied Moses, hardened his heart, and watched Egypt bleed through plagues. While that's still debated, it shows you something deeper. He represented power so absolute, so impersonal, that even ancient storytellers couldn't resist casting him as the villain. And finally, there's his mummy. When discovered, it showed a strong, tall frame, with worn teeth and hardened arteries. His face, leathery and sharp, looked as if it could still bark orders. In 1976, the mummy was flown to Paris for conservation work and given a passport. The occupation field? King deceased. Even in death, Ramesses demanded pageantry. That's the essence of his cruelty. He didn't beat it into you, he performed it for you. And the kingdom followed, because resisting would have meant breaking the show, and no one wanted to be the extra who ruined the scene. So now, as the sun dips behind the cliffs and those carved eyes of Abu Simbel start to blur into the darkness, you realize Ramesses didn't care if you loved him. He just needed you to remember him, forever. The empire of Ramesses eventually passed into quieter hands, but the silence didn't last. The world was changing empires, rising and falling like tide sand. Now Egypt faced a storm it couldn't tame, the Sea Peoples. Who they were, exactly, remains a mystery. Some say they were displaced tribes from the Aegean. Others suggest confederations of raiders, mercenaries and exiles. But when they came like fire. Cities crumbled, kingdoms vanished. And into this chaos stepped Pharaoh Meneptah, son of Ramesses II, who inherited not just a throne, but a collapsing stage. Meneptah was already an old man when he took power, likely in his 60s, after waiting in line behind dozens of elder brothers who had all predeceased their legendary father. You'd think an old ruler would lean towards stability, caution, diplomacy. But Meneptah entered office like a man who had nothing to prove and no time to waste. He was immediately confronted with rebellion in Canaan, raids from Libyans in the west, and the looming spectre of the Sea Peoples sailing down Egypt's coast with nothing to lose. His response? Swift, brutal, and unapologetic. In his 5th regnal year, Meneptah launched a campaign against the Libyan invaders and their Sea People allies. According to inscriptions, the battle was enormous. He claimed to have slaughtered over 6,000 enemies, captured 9,000 more, and chased the survivors into oblivion. You read the war stela carved at Karnak like a public warning, and it doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like a roar of desperation, loud enough to mask the cracks forming behind the curtain. Historians still argue about the scale of the invasion. Were the Sea Peoples truly a single, organized force, just a convenient name for a series of regional collapses? Some scholars believe Merneptah inflated the threat to bolster his legitimacy. Others think he saved Egypt from the same fate that devoured the Hittites, Mycenaeans, and countless coastal cities. Either way, his reaction was ferocious. He didn't just defeat them, he scattered them like sand, and made sure the record never let them forget it. The quirky bit? Merneptah's victory stelaith famous Israel stele contains the earliest known mention of Israel in any historical text, not as a nation, but as a people defeated. Israel is laid waste. It reads, "Its seed is no more." For a single line carved in stone, it carries unsettling weight, not because of its finality, but because of how casually it dismisses a people's existence. One sentence, one erasure. That was Merneptah's style. Cut sharp, move on. He wasn't a builder like his father. He didn't care about colossal monuments. His legacy was inked in campaigns, declarations, terse announcements of stability forced back into place. But when you study the gaps between those inscriptions, you find something worse than violence. You find control. Absolute, suffocating control. You walk through the remains of his mortuary temple less grand than Ramesses, more practical. The carvings are simpler, the depictions less theatrical, but the faces of his enemies are still contorted in pain, arms bound, knees buckled. The standard smiting pose of Egyptian king's arm raised, enemy gripped by the hair still dominates the scene. But in Merneptah's version, there's less triumph, more warning. There are suggestions that Merneptah employed harsh taxation and military conscription to sustain his kingdom during these crisis years. Grain storehouses were sealed tight. Records of rationing, delayed payments to temples, and regional officials begging for relief paint a picture of an Egypt not quite on fire, but definitely overheating. And Merneptah? He tightened his grip. You get the sense he saw leniency as a weakness Egypt could no longer afford. And then there's the mummy. Discovered in a royal cache at Deir el-Bahari, Merneptah's remains are surprisingly well preserved. He had arthritis, hardened arteries, and dental issue standard fare for an ancient royal. But his face? It's gaunt, stern, almost severe, like a man whose mouth never formed a smile unless it was followed by a command. There's no evidence Merneptah executed political rivals or purged his court, but absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. What we do know is that after his reign, Egypt teetered into a period of instability. His successors were weaker, the Sea Peoples returned, and eventually the great empire entered its long twilight. Still, Merneptah stood at the edge and shouted down the storm. His cruelty was not about bloodshed for its own sake. It was about survival, even if survival came at a cost. He would rather burn the edges of the kingdom than watch its heart collapse. That kind of cruelty isn't loud. It's procedural. It's written in ledgers, hidden in walls, buried in policy. One eerie feature of his inscriptions is the way he refers to enemies, not as armies, not as rebels, but as pests. They crawl, one line says. They skitter. Language that dehumanizes, that makes erasure feel like pest control. You don't have to hate what you destroy. You just have to stop seeing it as human. And in that, perhaps, lies Merneptah's legacy. He was not grand, he was not beloved, but he was effective. And when the Nile rises and recedes, washing over the lands he once defended, the reeds still bend, as if they remember a ruler who whispered, "Not yet," into the ears of ruin. As you leave his story behind, you don't feel awe or dread. You feel the echo of a voice that refused to flinch, even as the world shifted under his feet. Egypt survived for a while longer, but no survival comes without scars. And Merneptah etched his into the very skin of time. The sun sets slowly over the Nile, as it always has, but now the air feels different, thicker with perfume, with whispers, with ambition that doesn't march in sandals but glides in silk. You've walked through the dynasties of warriors, visionaries, and egomaniacs, but now the throne belongs to a woman, Cleopatra VII, the final pharaoh, the last whisper of a dying empire. And her cruelty? It's elegant, calculating, and dressed in beauty sharp enough to bleed. You know her name. Everyone does. But the Cleopatra of legends wrapped in gold, draped over couches, feeding grapes, to lovers was also a queen, born into a blood-stained family where survival meant strategy and love was often just leverage. When she took the throne in 51 BCE, Egypt was already buckling under Roman pressure. Her father, Ptolemy XII, had been little more than a puppet of Rome, and Cleopatra knew the game had changed. Swords were out. Politics was now seduction, loyalty a transaction. From the moment she stepped into power, Cleopatra faced a storm. Her co-ruler, a younger brother named Ptolemy XIII, tried to oust her almost immediately. Civil war followed. Armies clashed. Palaces burned. And through it all, Cleopatra didn't flinch. She fled to Syria, raised her own army, and returned ready to reclaim her crown. But the real turning point came not on the battlefield, but in a carpet. Historians still argue whether it was legend or brilliant PR, but the story goes, Cleopatra had herself smuggled into Julius Caesar's palace wrapped in a rug or a linen sack, emerging like a living spell. Whatever the truth, it worked. Caesar was enchanted. Not just by her appearances, was not the traditional Greek beauty, but by her mind. Her language skills, she reportedly spoke 9, and her audacity. She became his lover, bore him a son, and re-secured her throne. Quirky detail? Cleopatra was the only Ptolemaic ruler to bother learning Egyptian. Her ancestors, Macedonian Greeks descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals, had ruled for nearly 300 years and never spoke the native tongue. Cleopatra spoke it fluently. She knew appearances mattered, but language earned devotion. That's the difference between a ruler and a ruler who lasts. Still, her rise was not gentle. In a dynasty that devoured itself, Cleopatra was no stranger to lethal choices. She had her sister Arsinoe IV executed on temple steps. Some accounts claim the order came years after Arsinoe had been paraded in chains through Rome. When Cleopatra felt the threat resurface, she eliminated it. And that's the kind of cruelty that doesn't shout. It just ends you, quietly, efficiently. Later, after Caesar's assassination, she aligned herself with Mark Antony, Rome's power broker, whose loyalty she secured not just with affection but with political theatre. Their union was both passion and pact. They formed an eastern power bloc against Octavian, heir to Caesar. Cleopatra offered Egypt's riches, fleets, and spectacle. Antony gave her Rome's military muscle. Together, they dreamed of a new empire own, where Alexandria, not Rome, would be the beating heart. But dreams cost blood. Their alliance led to war. In 31 BCE, at the naval battle of Actium, their forces were defeated by Octavians. Cleopatra and Antony fled back to Egypt, where things unraveled quickly. In the aftermath, Cleopatra orchestrated a controlled unraveling of her image. She knew how she wanted to be remembered. One of her final acts was to stage her own death. When Antony heard she had died, he fell on his sword. Dying slowly, he was brought to her, where he bled out in her arms. The performance of tragedy was precise Greek drama brought to life. And when Octavian entered Alexandria, Cleopatra retreated into her tomb, gathered her treasures, and according to most accounts let an asp bite her. Historians still debate the method. Was it poison? A smuggled snake? or a more clinical cocktail delivered by servants. Doesn't matter. What matters is that Cleopatra refused to be paraded through Rome as a trophy. She chose myth over mockery, and that, in itself, is a kind of cruelty to deny your enemy their final victory. She left behind a kingdom absorbed into the Roman Empire. Egypt never again ruled itself, but Cleopatra ruled perception. In death, she became larger than life. Statues, coins, plays, and later, Elizabeth Taylor's eyeliner. But beneath the glamour was a ruler who made cold, hard decisions wrapped in velvet. She didn't scream. She didn't rage. She smiled, made you feel special, and then used you if she had to. Her cruelty wasn't casual. It was focused, tactical, and it worked until it didn't. Now, as you step away from her ruined palace in Alexandria, listening to the waves lap against sunken columns beneath the harbour, you realize that cruelty takes many forms. Some pharaohs bled the land dry with taxes, some killed with armies, some erased names, and some, like Cleopatra, weaponized legacy. She's the last in a long line, and though she left no dynasty, no empire, and no tomb we've yet found, she left something far more durable: curiosity. We still ask who she really was. We still search for her bones, and somewhere, in that soft silence between tides, you imagine her smirking, because that was her final act, to outlive even her defeat. And now, finally, you exhale. The sands settle behind you, the monuments fade into silhouettes, and the echoes of commands, chants, and screams fall into silence. Egypt sleeps. Its gods rest in broken temples. Its kings and queens lie in tombs some found, some still hidden, and the cruelty that built their reigns crumbles one grain of limestone at a time. You've walked through ages of stone and gold, watched blood dry on throne rooms, and stood in the shadows of rulers who saw themselves not just as leaders, but as living divinities. Some, like Sneferu, wore charm like a second crown, and buried their ambition beneath polished pyramids. Others, like Khufu and Khafre, loomed over time itself, whispering authority through stone that never speaks. Pepi II ruled too long to remember joy. Ahmose wielded revenge like ritual. Thutmose III turned erasure into policy. Akhenaten turned faith into tyranny, and poor Tutankhamun was swallowed by silence not of his making. Then came Seti, who polished power into something beautiful, and Ramesses, who performed it like eternal theatre. Merneptah didn't have time for illusion. She defended Egypt with clenched fists. And Cleopatra? She played the long game, until there were no moves left but legend. You're probably feeling something heavy now, maybe even a little breathless. That's okay. History is like that, especially when it's whispered at night. It's not just about what happened. It's about who made it happen and what they were willing to do to stay remembered. Some of these pharaohs built wonders. Some built prisons. Some built lies. But all of them, in their own way, shaped the story we still try to understand. Now close your eyes. Picture the Nile under moonlight, lazy and silver, winding past ruined columns and broken jackal statues. Somewhere, a breeze stirs the reeds. Somewhere deeper, unseen chambers hold secrets still untouched by archaeologists, still wrapped in shadows. You're safe now. The kings are long dead. Their voices are gone. Only the sand keeps speaking, and tonight, it's quiet. Sleep well, traveller of time.